The seismograph spiked at 4:03 a.m. and 17 seconds later, a man I had never met grabbed my arm in the dark and said, "Don't move." And the thing is, I didn't. I just didn't. My name is Levan Marsh. I'm 38 years old. I am a licensed underground operations engineer for the Boise Basin Nuclear Extraction Facility, one of 3 such facilities in the American West, and the only one sitting on a fault line that the Geological Survey has been politely worried about for 11 years. My job is the pipes, not the reactors. Those belong to a different department with better funding and worse hours. My job is the pressure network, 62 miles of subsurface piping that carries coolant, drainage, and treated water through a facility built 300 feet below the high desert of southwestern Idaho. When those pipes are healthy, nobody thinks about them. When they are not healthy, I get a call. I got the call at 3:58 a.m. A 4.1 magnitude event had registered on the facility's internal seismic array. Preliminary sensor sweep showed pressure anomalies in sectors 7 through 11, exactly the sectors where the primary coolant return line runs parallel to the old mining shafts that the facility had been built around and that I had been, for 2 years, quietly arguing were too close to the new infrastructure. I was in Sector 9 at 4:03 a.m. reading a pressure gauge by headlamp when the aftershock hit and the lights went out and a hand closed around my arm in the dark. "Don't move," the voice said, low, steady. The kind of steady that isn't calm by nature but calm by training. A person who has decided at some point that panic costs more than it's worth. There's a floor crack 2 feet in front of you. It wasn't there 20 minutes ago. I didn't move. The emergency lighting kicked on at the 4-second mark, red, dim enough. In its light I could see the crack. A clean diagonal fracture across the concrete floor of Sector 9, maybe 8 feet long, running toward the primary line housing. And beside me, hand still on my arm, was a man I had never seen in this facility before. He was around my age, tall, dark work jacket with a radiation monitoring badge clipped to the chest, visitor clearance, level 2, and in his other hand a diagnostic tablet running a pipe network overlay I recognized as the city's municipal water modeling software. "You're not facility staff," I said. "Boise Public Works," he said. "Pipe network. I've been here since midnight." His hand released my arm, slowly, like he was making sure I had my footing before he let go. "Your facility's eastern drainage conduits connect to municipal mains at 3 junction points. If your primary line fails in Sector 9, the contamination reaches the aquifer," I said. "In approximately 4 hours, he said, "at current pressure differential." We looked at each other in the red emergency light. The crack in the floor sat between us like a sentence neither of us had finished. "I'm Levan," I said. "Idris Calloway," he said, "and I think we have a problem. But here's what I need you to understand before I tell you what happened next, because this is the part that changes how the whole night reads. I had been in this facility for 6 years. I had written 3 internal reports on the seismic risk profile of the eastern sectors. All 3 had been reviewed, acknowledged, and filed. The facility's position, consistent across all 3 responses, was that the Geological Survey's concern was based on modeling that didn't account for the facility's isolation protocols, that the shafts were sufficiently separated from the active infrastructure to make a cascade failure statistically remote. Idris Calloway from Boise Public Works had written 2 external reports on the same risk from the other direction, from the municipal pipe network's perspective, looking inward at what a facility coolant breach would do to the aquifer system that served 300,000 people. His reports had been reviewed by a joint committee 14 months ago. The committee's conclusion was that coordination between the facility and the city should be enhanced. We had never met. We had been, for 2 years, working on opposite sides of the same problem, the same fault line, the same pipes, the same risk, without knowing the other person existed. And now, we were standing 3 feet apart in a red-lit underground corridor with a new floor crack between us, and 4 hours before everything we'd both been worried about became everyone's problem. "Your reports," I said. "The aquifer modeling. You ran junction pressure scenarios." "All 3 junctions," he said. "Junction 2 is the critical point. If your Sector 9 line loses integrity," he turned his tablet toward me, His modeling software and my facility schematics, side by side on the same screen. 2 years of separate work, suddenly adjacent. It's not a slow leak, it's a pressure event. It blows fast. I looked at the screen. I looked at the crack. Junction 2 is 400 meters east, I said, through sectors 10 and 11. I know, he said. I've been trying to reach your operations director since 1 a.m. He's coordinating the seismic response from the Surface Command Center. Can you get him? I can do better than that, I said. I can get us to Junction 2. Wait, because what I said next was either the best or worst decision of my career, and I'm still not entirely sure which. Follow me, I said. Exactly where I step. The floor mapping in these sectors isn't updated for tonight's event. He fell in behind me without a word. That was the first thing I noticed about Idris Calloway, his willingness to follow when following was correct, without performing reluctance about it. Some people, when they are skilled and certain and used to being the expert in the room, can't follow without making it visible, can't take direction without a micro-negotiation that wastes the seconds you don't have. Idris fell in behind me like it was the obvious move, because it was, and we started moving. The corridors in the eastern sectors are narrow, 2 people wide if those people are comfortable with proximity, 1 person wide if they're not. We were comfortable. I don't know exactly when that became true. I think it was true from the moment his hand closed on my arm in the dark and didn't let go until he was sure I had my footing. At the junction between sectors 9 and 10, the corridor narrowed further. Old mining architecture, pre-facility, the original shaft lining from the 1960s that the engineers had built around, because removing it would have cost more than designing around it. I turned sideways to fit. Idris was close behind me, and in the tight space his hand found my shoulder. Not gripping, just maintaining contact, tracking my position in the dim emergency lighting. Sensor point, I said, stopping at the wall panel. Give me 30 seconds. Take 40, he said. His hand was still on my shoulder. I was aware of it the way you're aware of the only warm thing in a cold room. The sensor reading came back in 28 seconds. Pressure in Sector 10, elevated but stable. The line was holding. We're okay through 10, I said. 11? He said. 11 is where I'm worried. His hand pressed once, brief, certain, against my shoulder. Not a squeeze exactly, more like a period at the end of a sentence. Understood. Keep going. We kept going. Sector 11 took us 14 minutes. The corridor floor had shifted in 2 places. Minor heave, nothing structural, but enough to change the footing and require detours through the maintenance access route that added distance and cut ceiling height to approximately 5.5 feet. Idris is around 6 feet. I heard him adjust his posture behind me without complaint, without commentary, just adapting. The way a person adapts who has learned that the environment doesn't owe you accommodation, and getting resentful about it is a waste of attention you need for other things. At the Sector 11 pressure manifold, I ran the diagnostic sequence. It takes 4 minutes when the system is nominal. Tonight it took 7 because 2 of the sensor nodes were returning partial data. Not failed, partial, which is often worse because partial data looks like information when it might be noise. Idris stood beside me at the manifold panel. Close, the access alcove was not designed for 2 people, and he had his tablet out, running his municipal overlay alongside my facility readings. Our elbows were touching. Neither of us moved to correct it. Your Node 4 reading, he said, after a moment. See how it's cycling? That's not a sensor fault. I looked where he was pointing. He was right. The cycling pattern was consistent with micro-vibration in the pipe housing. The line was experiencing oscillation from the seismic event, which meant the stress wasn't static. It was dynamic. Dynamic stress fails differently and faster than static. If it's oscillating, I said, the Junction 2 seal is the weak point. Junction 2 seal was installed in 2019, he said. I have the spec sheet. He pulled it up on the tablet. Rated for static load, not rated for dynamic oscillation, I said. We looked at each other. The alcove was small. His face was close to mine. Not engineered closeness, just the closeness of 2 people in a space that doesn't have room for distance. The emergency lighting in Sector 11 had more amber in it than the red of Sector 9, and in that light his eyes were the particular brown that looks almost gold at certain angles. And I was thinking about the spec sheet and the oscillation cycle and the junction 2 seal, and also, simultaneously, about the fact that his shoulder was warm against mine and had been for the last 4 minutes. "We need to reach junction 2 before that seal fails," he said. "160 meters," I said. 7 minutes if the floor is clear. Is it clear? I checked my schematic. Unknown. Post-event. "So we go carefully," he said. "We go carefully," I agreed. Neither of us moved for one more second. Just looked at each other in the amber red light in the close alcove, with the oscillating pipe and the failing seal and the aquifer and the 300,000 people above us. 1 second of stillness in the middle of everything moving. Then we went. Here is what I have learned about emergencies in 6 years underground. They compress time in both directions. The minutes stretch, every step careful, every reading deliberate, every decision carrying weight that daylight decisions don't carry. And simultaneously, hours disappear. You look up, and it's been 3 hours, and it feels like 40 minutes and also like 3 days. The 160 meters to Junction 2 took 11 minutes. We found 2 more floor cracks, one section of ceiling that had dropped 2 inches on its support brackets, and a pressure valve that had partially discharged. A relief event, the system doing what it was designed to do, but leaving a floor slick with condensation that required both of us to move very slowly and very close together through a section where the handrail had come off its mounting. I went first. At the worst section, maybe 8 feet of slick concrete, no rail, ceiling dripping, I turned back and held out my hand. Idris took it. We crossed those 8 feet with his hand in mine, and neither of us let go immediately when the footing improved. We held on for maybe 10 steps beyond necessity until the floor was clearly dry and there was no reasonable operational justification for the contact, and then, slowly, by mutual and unspoken agreement, we released. "Thank you," he said. "The floor was—" I started. "I know what the floor was," he said. Quietly, with a small smile I could see even in the dim light. "Thank you anyway." Junction 2 was intact. The seal was stressed, oscillation stressed, exactly as the spec sheet and Idris's analysis predicted, but it had not failed. We had approximately 90 minutes before it would. 90 minutes was enough. I reached the operations director at 5:31 a.m. Idris had the municipal emergency coordinator on his phone simultaneously. Within 22 minutes, we had a joint. Response team deploying from the surface with seal replacement equipment and a pressure bypass protocol that Idris had, I found out later, drafted and submitted to the facility 18 months ago as a contingency recommendation. The recommendation had been filed. Tonight it saved the aquifer. At 6:44 a.m., the bypass was active. The oscillation stress was transferred to the redundant line. The Junction 2 seal was scheduled for replacement at first shift. The contamination risk was closed. I sat down on the floor of Junction 2's access chamber, concrete, cold, exactly as uncomfortable as it sounds, and felt the specific weight of a crisis that has been resolved settle into my body all at once. It is not a light feeling. It is not relief exactly. It is more like the moment after you've been holding something very heavy for a very long time and you've been allowed to set it down, and your muscles don't quite believe it yet. Idris sat down beside me, not across the chamber. Beside me, shoulders touching, backs against the same wall, legs stretched out on the same floor. The access chamber was large enough that this was a choice. "You wrote the bypass protocol," I said. 18 months ago, he said. "I wrote the seismic risk report," I said. "For Sector 9, 3 times. He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I read all 3. I turned to look at him. He was already looking at me. In the access chamber, the emergency lighting had finally normalized. White now, functional, the kind of light that shows things clearly and without flattery. In that light, his face was tired and certain and something else. Something I recognized because I had been feeling it for the last 3 hours and hadn't had a name for it until right now. "You read my reports," I said. "I referenced your second one in my junction pressure paper," he said. Footnote 14. I didn't see your paper. Nobody sent it to the facility. A pause. Not bitter, just factual. I sent it to the committee. The committee enhanced coordination, I said. Yes, he said. They did. We looked at each other for a long moment. The pipe above us was steady now. The seal was holding. 300,000 people were drinking safe water and didn't know it, and wouldn't know it, and that was completely fine. That was, in fact, the job. To be the thing that holds so that everyone above you can go about their lives without thinking about what's underneath. Idris, I said. Yeah. I want to read your paper. Something moved through his expression. Slow, like the seismic readings. You have to be watching the right instrument to catch it. I'll send it to you, he said. I want to read it with you, I said, so I can ask questions. He looked at me. The kind of look that is evaluating something that has nothing to do with pipe networks or aquifer modeling or junction seal specifications. The kind of look that is looking at you. That's a long paper, he said. I have time, I said. It might take more than one meeting. I'm aware, I said. The corner of his mouth moved, then the whole mouth moved, then his eyes changed. That slow, traveling warmth that starts somewhere internal and arrives on the surface with the careful unhurriedness of a man who has learned not to spend feeling carelessly. Okay, he said, quietly. Then okay. And now I need to tell you about the moment I keep returning to. The one that happened not in the crisis but after it, and that I think was always going to happen, regardless of the seismograph or the floor cracks or the junction seal. We were waiting for the surface team's confirmation ping at 7:02 a.m. Sitting against the same wall, shoulders in contact, both of us looking at the pipe manifold across the chamber because it was easier than looking at each other, and we both knew it. His tablet was balanced on his knee, my schematic reader on mine, and the screens were both dark because there was nothing left to read. His hand was on the floor between us, open, not reaching, just present, the way hands are present when they've stopped pretending to be doing something else. I looked at it. I looked at the manifold. I looked at his hand again. I moved mine until our fingers overlapped, not holding, overlapping. The small bones of our hands finding each other in the space between us, quiet and unhurried, like two instruments finding the same note. He didn't move. He didn't pull away and he didn't close the grip immediately. He let it happen, and then, slowly with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, his fingers curled around mine. We sat like that. The pipe held, the seal held, the aquifer held. Above us, Boise, Idaho was waking up, the high desert light coming over the foothills, the Boise River catching it, the city moving into its Tuesday with no knowledge of what had happened 300 feet below it, and no reason to need that knowledge. That's the job. But this was something else. This was two people who had been working on the same problem from opposite directions for 2 years, finally sitting in the same room, the same cold floor, the same light. Finally, adjacent. Finally, in the specific language of hands in a quiet room, saying, I see what you were looking at. I was looking at it too. The surface team's ping came at 7:09 a.m. We stood up. We didn't release hands immediately. That's the honest answer. We stood, and the grip held for a moment past the need for it, and then Idris looked down at our hands, and then up at my face, and the expression on his was one of the most unguarded things I have ever seen on a person who is very practiced at being guarded. The paper, he said. I'll send it tonight. Send it, I said, and come read it with me. Saturday. I know a place near the boys' depot. They do coffee until noon. I'll be there, he said, without deliberating. Like it was information he'd already had and just needed the right question to deliver it. His hand squeezed once, brief, firm, warm, and then released. We walked out of Junction 2 together, back through Sectors 11 and 10 and 9, through the narrow corridors and the shifted floor and the tight spots that required proximity, and this time the emergency lighting was normalizing section by section as the facility came back online, and by the time we reached the main access elevator, the fluorescents were white and full, and the schematic boards were live, and the facility was resuming its ordinary operations as if the night had been a parenthesis, as if 300,000 people's water had not spent 7 hours balanced on a seal that was never rated for dynamic load. In the elevator, just us ascending, he looked at the floor counter and I looked at his profile in the clean overhead light, and I thought about footnote 14 in a paper I had never read, and a risk report that had been filed 3 times and ignored twice, and 2 people arriving at the same problem from opposite ends and somehow, on a night when the ground itself couldn't hold still, finding each other in the middle. The elevator reached the surface. The doors opened. Idaho morning came in. Cold, wide, the high desert sky doing that thing it does in early morning where it's 7 different colors at once, and none of them are quite nameable. Idris stepped out first. Then he stopped and turned, and the morning light hit his face full on, and he was looking at me with an expression I already knew I was going to spend significant time thinking about. "Saturday," he said. "Saturday," I said. He walked toward the parking area. I watched him go. Not dramatically, not with any particular performance of feeling, just watched the way you watch something you want to make sure you remember correctly. Then I went back inside to file the incident report. There is a facility security camera at the main access elevator. The footage timestamp reads 7:23 a.m. 2 men step out of the elevator into Idaho morning light. One stops, turns. They stand facing each other in the open door frame. The facility's fluorescent interior behind them, the high desert sky ahead. They are close, not touching. Their faces are turned toward each other, and the morning light is hitting both of them, and the expression on each face is the kind that security cameras are not really designed to capture, but sometimes do anyway when the angle is right and the light is honest. The footage holds for 31 seconds. In those 31 seconds, neither of them moves away. I have watched that footage twice. I will probably watch it again, not for the report. The report is filed, complete, accurate to the sensor reading, for myself. For the specific and private satisfaction of watching the moment a thing that had been building for 2 years, in footnotes, in filed reports, in parallel work on opposite sides of the same problem, finally arrive at its surface. 31 seconds. The ground, that morning, was perfectly still.